What if the atomic bomb had never been invented? What if one of the deadliest inventions in human history had never existed? What if the atomic bomb, the weapon that forever changed the rules of war and peace, had never been built? Would the world be a safer place, or would we have found other, perhaps even darker ways to destroy ourselves? Today, let's dive into this alternate reality and explore what our world might look like without the atomic bomb. Imagine it's August 1945. World War II has raged for nearly 6 years, leaving much of the world in ruins. Nazi Germany has surrendered, but in the Pacific, Japan remains defiant. In our timeline, the atomic bomb forced Japan's surrender and ended the war within days. But what if the bomb had never been invented? How would this brutal conflict have ended? Without the atomic bomb, the United States faced an agonizing decision. The planned invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, was the largest military operation ever devised. It would have begun with Operation Olympic, a full-scale assault on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu, followed by Operation Coronet, targeting the main island of Honshu and the capital, Tokyo. Military planners predicted staggering losses. U.S. forces alone were expected to suffer hundreds of thousands of casualties, possibly even surpassing 1 million. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, would have been even worse. Japan's military leadership had trained not only soldiers but also civilians, including women and children, to fight to the death. Schoolgirls learned to wield bamboo spears. Suicide charges and kamikaze attacks would have been relentless. Urban warfare, as seen in Okinawa, would have turned Japan's cities into hellish battlefields. But there was another twist waiting in the wings: the Soviet Union. In our history, the Soviets declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, mere days before Japan surrendered. They swept through Japanese-held territories in Manchuria and Korea with stunning speed. But in a world without the atomic bomb, Japan wouldn't have surrendered so quickly. The Soviets, smelling opportunity, might have pressed further. It's entirely possible that the Red Army would have invaded Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, or even attempted to take parts of Honshu. This could have led to a divided Japan, much like post-war Germany and Korea. Imagine a world where Tokyo was split between American and Soviet sectors, where an East Japan fell under communist influence while a West Japan aligned with the United States. The Cold War's front line might have stretched not just through Berlin, but also through Kyoto and Osaka. But would Japan have surrendered without the bomb? Some historians argue yes, eventually. By mid-1945, Japan's economy was shattered, its cities devastated by relentless firebombing, and its people starving due to naval blockades. The infamous firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed over 100,000 people in a single night, more than the atomic bomb would kill in Nagasaki. Yet, despite the suffering, Japan's military leadership clung to the hope of negotiating better surrender terms. They wanted to preserve the emperor's role and avoid total occupation. Without the sudden shock of nuclear destruction, Japan might have held out longer, hoping the U.S. would tire of the fight or the Soviets would broker a peace deal. The war could have dragged into 1946 or beyond, costing millions more lives. Cities like Kyoto, Yokohama, and even Sapporo might have suffered firebombings on the scale of Dresden or Hamburg. Meanwhile, the absence of the atomic bomb would have shifted global power balances. In the actual timeline, the sudden end of the war allowed the U.S. to assert dominance in the Pacific before the Soviets could expand further. Without the bomb, the Soviets might have taken more territory, strengthening their post-war position in Asia. The balance of power in the Cold War could have tilted eastward, with communist influence stretching deep into the Pacific. The Japanese people's suffering would have been unimaginable. Starvation, disease, and the horrors of invasion would have left scars for generations. And what about American and Allied soldiers? The greatest generation would have endured even greater losses, possibly changing American society's post-war optimism into something darker and more scarred by prolonged conflict. In the end, It's possible that Japan would have surrendered after suffering enough conventional bombing and invasion pressure. But without the decisive shock of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war's end would have been messier, bloodier, and slower. The cost in human life, both Japanese and Allied, would have been staggering. And beyond the battlefield, the absence of the atomic bomb would have delayed the dawning of the nuclear age. For better or worse, the bomb forced humanity to confront its destructive potential. Without it, we may have learned those lessons later. Perhaps too late, or perhaps never at all. But that's only the beginning. The bomb didn't just end World War II, it shaped the entire second half of the 20th century. And without it, the Cold War itself would have looked very different. The Cold War as we know it was defined by a single terrifying reality: mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The United States and the Soviet Union built enough nuclear weapons to wipe out human civilization several times over. Ironically, this shared fear of total annihilation kept both superpowers from engaging in direct military conflict. But in a world where the atomic bomb was never invented, how would that tense standoff have evolved? Without nuclear weapons, the Cold War wouldn't have disappeared. The ideological struggle between capitalism and communism was too deeply rooted. But without the looming shadow of nuclear war, the nature of their rivalry would have changed dramatically. Instead of stockpiling intercontinental ballistic missiles, both nations might have thrown their resources into developing the next generation of conventional weapons, chemical and biological arms, and advanced air and naval forces. Imagine an arms race where the most destructive weapons weren't hidden underground in missile silos, but deployed on battlefields around the world. And what about the conflicts that defined the Cold War era? The Korean War, for example, could have played out much differently. In our history, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur famously wanted to use atomic bombs against Chinese forces supporting North Korea. President Truman refused, fearing the start of World War III. But without nuclear weapons in the picture, that decision might have been far easier. The war in Korea might have escalated into a full-scale conventional war between the United States and China, and potentially the Soviet Union. Korea could have been the first front in a much larger, bloodier global war. Or take the Vietnam War. Without the nuclear threat keeping the superpowers in check, it's possible that the Soviet Union or China might have sent regular troops to support North Vietnam, while the United States escalated its military presence beyond airstrikes and advisors. What was, in our timeline, a bitter proxy war fought through local forces and insurgencies could have become a full-scale confrontation between the American and Soviet militaries. Southeast Asia might have become ground zero for a global struggle. But perhaps the most fascinating question is what would have happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. In our history, it was the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev stood on the brink of apocalypse, and the fear of mutual destruction forced both men to compromise. Without nuclear weapons, however, the crisis would have unfolded very differently. The Soviets might never have stationed missiles in Cuba to begin with, making the crisis unnecessary. Or, conversely, the U.S. might have launched a full-scale invasion of Cuba without fear of starting a nuclear exchange. The result could have been the toppling of Castro's communist regime, potentially triggering Soviet retaliation elsewhere in the world. In a nuclear-free world, the Cold War might have been less cold. Without the deterrent of absolute destruction, both superpowers may have felt freer to engage each other directly on battlefields in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East. The Cold War might have resembled the conflicts of the early 20th century, brutal, bloody, and fought with tanks, jets, and battleships rather than political threats and proxy wars. Ironically, this alternate Cold War could have been more dangerous, not less. Nuclear weapons, for all their horror, forced caution on both sides. When every decision carries the risk of human extinction, leaders think twice before pulling the trigger. Remove that existential threat, and wars, though less catastrophic in scope, might have become more common. The world might have witnessed a series of grinding, large-scale conventional wars between the U.S. and USSR in places like Eastern Europe, the Middle East, or Southeast Asia. And the arms race wouldn't have ended. It would have shifted. Instead of nuclear submarines and long-range bombers, the US and USSR might have developed massive fleets of aircraft carriers, supersonic bombers, and chemical weapons delivery systems. Chemical and biological warfare, which was mostly sidelined in our world by the threat of nuclear retaliation, might have been used more openly with horrifying effects. Would NATO and the Warsaw Pact have remained as purely defensive alliances, or would they have turned into vehicles for aggressive expansion? Without the nuclear sword hanging over them, Western and Eastern Europe might have become the primary battleground, with tanks rolling across the plains of Germany in a war of attrition and territorial conquest. The absence of nuclear weapons could have also opened the door for other nations to play bigger roles. Britain, France, and China, who in our history built their own nuclear arsenals, would have had to find other ways to assert their power. Regional conflicts in the Middle East, Africa, and South America, places where the superpowers once waged proxy battles, might have become direct US-Soviet confrontations. The Cold War without nuclear weapons wouldn't have been a peaceful rivalry. It might have been a more traditional global war, fought in theaters across the world, with shifting alliances, massive casualties, and no fear of total annihilation to stop it. But would this world have been better or worse? Fewer people would have lived under the constant fear of nuclear annihilation, but many more might have died in a series of endless, grinding conventional wars. The shadow of Hiroshima never would have taught humanity just how far our destructive power could reach. And without that lesson, we might have been more reckless, not less. The Cold War might still have ended one day, but at what cost, and after how much bloodshed? The atomic bomb was a terrifying weapon, but it was also the catalyst for one of humanity's most profound scientific revolutions. Before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear fission was a laboratory curiosity, a barely understood phenomenon explored by physicists in quiet university halls. But the Manhattan Project, America's crash effort to build the bomb, poured billions of dollars and thousands of brilliant minds into cracking the secrets of the atom. This wartime urgency not only created a weapon of mass destruction, but also jump-started the nuclear age, with peaceful uses that have shaped our world ever since. Now imagine a world where the bomb was never built. No Manhattan Project, no secret cities like Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, no urgent need to harness nuclear energy in just a few short years. Without the war pushing nuclear science forward at breakneck speed, it's very likely that civilian nuclear power would have developed much more slowly. In our reality, the first nuclear power plants appeared in the 1950s and 60s, providing clean electricity to millions. But in this alternate world, the development of nuclear reactors might not have occurred until the 1970s or 1980s, or even later. Countries struggling with energy shortages after World War II might have doubled down on coal, oil, and hydroelectric dams instead. The transition to nuclear energy, which promised nearly limitless power without the pollution of fossil fuels, could have been delayed by decades. And it wasn't just energy production. The medical world benefited enormously from nuclear science. Radiation therapy, which has saved countless lives by targeting cancer cells, emerged directly from the research that began during the war. Nuclear isotopes became vital tools in medical imaging and diagnostics, from X-rays to PET scans. Industrial sectors, too, used nuclear technology for sterilization, quality control, and material analysis. Without the atomic bomb accelerating this research, millions of people may have lost out on life-saving treatments or waited decades longer for them. But some might ask, wouldn't we have discovered nuclear energy eventually? After all, the science was already moving in that direction before the war. Physicists like Enrico Fermi, Lise Meitner, and Otto Hahn had already discovered nuclear fission in the 1930s. The peaceful applications of the atom were inevitable, right? Perhaps, but science doesn't happen in a vacuum. The Manhattan Project didn't just throw money at the problem, it brought together the greatest scientific minds of the era from all over the world, working with resources and urgency that peacetime rarely provides. Without that massive wartime effort, nuclear research would have progressed at the slower, fragmented pace typical of academic science. Breakthroughs that came in 5 years might have taken 20 or more. And what about our understanding of physics itself? Quantum mechanics, the science of the very small, was still a young field in the 1940s. The Manhattan Project forced physicists to wrestle with quantum theory's most complex puzzles, from neutron behavior to energy release. Without that concentrated effort, the development of nuclear physics and related fields like particle physics and quantum computing could have stagnated. Our entire understanding of the universe, at its most fundamental level, might have lagged decades behind. Even space exploration could have been affected. Radioactive isotopes developed for nuclear weapons research later became critical components of spacecraft power systems, including those that powered missions to the outer planets. Without the nuclear revolution, the space race itself might have been slower, leaving humanity grounded just a little longer. But here's the irony. Without the bomb, would the world have been more trusting of nuclear energy? In our timeline, nuclear power has always been haunted by the shadow of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and later, Chernobyl and Fukushima. Public fear of radiation, shaped by its wartime origins, led many nations to abandon or restrict nuclear energy. If the atom's first appearance on the world stage had been as a peaceful energy source, not a weapon, perhaps public perception would have been different. Perhaps nuclear power plants would have spread faster and wider, giving us a cleaner, more sustainable energy grid today. Or perhaps we would have feared nuclear energy anyway. Even peaceful atoms are dangerous when mishandled. And human history suggests that wherever we find great power, we also find great risk. Ultimately, the absence of the atomic bomb would have delayed humanity's mastery of the atom. Whether that delay would have made the world safer or simply left us in the dark longer is a question without an easy answer. What's clear is that war, tragically, often accelerates technological progress. The bomb that destroyed 2 cities also built the foundation for the nuclear reactors that power our homes and the therapies that save our lives. But this peaceful side of the nuclear age was just one part of the story. In the absence of the bomb, the global power structure might have looked very different, and we'll explore that next. In the world we know, nuclear weapons reshaped the global order. After World War II, the atomic bomb helped cement the United States as the world's most powerful nation. But what if the bomb had never been built? How would the post-war power structure have evolved? Would America still have emerged as the world's leading superpower? Or would other nations have risen faster to challenge its dominance? Without nuclear weapons, the U.S. would still have been the strongest economy and the most industrially advanced country after World War II. But the absence of nuclear deterrence would have made America's power less absolute. In the real world, the atomic bomb gave Washington unmatched military leverage. Countries couldn't risk challenging U.S. authority directly because they feared atomic retaliation. Without that weapon in America's arsenal, rivals like the Soviet Union and later China might have moved more boldly and more quickly. The Soviet Union, having expanded westward into Eastern Europe and eastward into Asia during the final months of World War II, would have been the United States' chief rival regardless. But without the atomic bomb holding them back, Soviet forces might have been even more aggressive. Eastern Europe, already behind the Iron Curtain, might have expanded further westward into Germany, France, or Italy. American and British forces, lacking the ultimate deterrent, might have struggled to hold the line. And what about the formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact? In our reality, NATO was formed in 1949 as a defensive alliance to counter the Soviet nuclear threat. But without nukes, NATO might have had a different character, less about deterrence and more about preparing for conventional warfare. Troop deployments and tank divisions in Europe could have been far larger, with both sides constantly on edge, preparing for large-scale ground invasions. The Warsaw Pact, instead of forming primarily in response to NATO's nuclear umbrella, might have been built as an offensive alliance aiming to spread communism by force. China's rise as a global power also might have accelerated. In our world, China's nuclear test in 1964 gave it a seat at the global superpower table. Without nuclear weapons defining global influence, China's enormous manpower and industrial potential could have allowed it to project power across Asia decades earlier. Conflicts like the Korean War or the Taiwan Strait crises might have been larger, more conventional wars, as China sought to expand its regional dominance without fear of nuclear retaliation. And let's not forget Britain and France. These two European powers, still reeling from the war, used their nuclear weapons programs to maintain a seat at the superpower table. Without nukes, their influence might have declined faster. Or, conversely, they might have doubled down on colonial military power, holding on to empires in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia longer, trying to compensate for their lack of atomic deterrence. Emerging nations would have followed a different path too. In our timeline, countries like India, Pakistan, and Israel built nuclear weapons to counter regional threats and assert their independence on the global stage. But in this alternate history, they would have relied on conventional armies, alliances, and economic strength to secure their place in the world. Would India and Pakistan's rivalry have played out in a series of conventional wars instead of a tense nuclear standoff? Would Israel's security have depended solely on its air force and intelligence agencies, rather than the unspoken deterrent of a nuclear arsenal? More broadly, without the nuclear arms race defining global politics, we might have seen the rise of a multipolar world much earlier. Instead of two superpowers holding the world hostage, there could have been 3, 4, or even 5 major powers vying for influence, each relying on tanks, planes, and ships rather than warheads. Japan, rebuilt through American aid, might have become a military power again. Brazil, with its vast resources, or South Africa, with its strategic location, might have emerged as regional leaders. But a world without nuclear weapons wouldn't necessarily have been more peaceful. Without the balance of terror, conflicts that were once kept in check by the fear of escalation might have erupted into full-blown wars. Europe could have seen another continent-wide conflict in the 1950s or 60s. The Middle East, already a powder keg, might have exploded into far larger regional wars without the moderating effect of global superpowers fearing nuclear escalation. Diplomacy, too, would have taken a different shape. Summits like the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, which defined much of Cold War diplomacy, would never have existed. Instead, nations might have focused on conventional arms treaties, regional defense pacts, and territorial negotiations. In many ways, nuclear weapons froze the global power structure. The threat of total destruction forced nations to maintain an uneasy balance. Without them, the post-war world might have been far more dynamic, but also far more unstable. Superpowers would have risen and fallen faster, alliances would have shifted more frequently, and wars might have been more common. The United States may still have emerged as the leading power, but its dominance would have been less secure, constantly challenged by rivals both old and new. The world map we know today, divided neatly between East and West, North and South, might have looked far messier, shaped by decades of conventional wars and shifting alliances rather than nuclear deterrence. But even in this chaotic, bomb-free world, humanity's thirst for power and influence would have found new battlegrounds. And in the absence of atomic weapons, the future of warfare might have taken some unexpected and terrifying turns. So, what about today? Would the world we live in now be safer or far more dangerous, without nuclear weapons casting their long, terrifying shadow over international politics? On the surface, it seems obvious. Without weapons capable of wiping out entire cities in minutes, humanity should be safer. But history and human nature suggest something more complicated. Without the bomb, today's geopolitical tensions might burn hotter, not cooler. Countries like North Korea, Iran, and Russia have long relied on nuclear weapons, or the pursuit of them, to punch above their weight on the global stage. Without nuclear deterrence, these nations might have turned to more aggressive conventional military action to achieve their goals. Would North Korea have invaded South Korea again, without fear of American nuclear retaliation? Would Russia have pushed deeper into Europe, seeing no nuclear threat from NATO? Would Iran have waged a larger conventional war against its neighbors, unchecked by fears of nuclear escalation? Nuclear weapons, for all their horror, have historically made world leaders pause. Launching a war when you know it could end your own civilization forces restraint. Without that restraint, conventional wars might have been more frequent and far bloodier in the 20th and 21st centuries. Instead of a long peace between major powers, we might have seen World War III and IV and V. And in the shadows of these global rivalries, terrorism and asymmetric warfare would likely have flourished. Today, terrorists and rogue states avoid directly provoking nuclear-armed nations. But in a world without that ultimate deterrent, insurgencies, proxy wars, and terrorist attacks could have grown far bolder. The U.S. might have faced not just isolated acts of terror, but full-scale conventional attacks on its overseas bases, shipping lanes, or even its homeland, as rival nations sought to weaken American influence through brute force. But the absence of nuclear weapons wouldn't have left the world stuck in 1940s-style warfare forever. Human ingenuity, especially in war, always finds new frontiers. Instead of nuclear bombs, we might have seen a faster rise of cyber warfare, artificial intelligence-driven combat, and space-based weapons. Satellites might have been weaponized earlier, targeting enemy communications and missile defenses from orbit. Cyber attacks on power grids, financial systems, and military networks might have become the weapons of choice for superpowers and terrorists alike. Imagine wars fought not with bombs and bullets, but with algorithms and satellites. Battles where artificial intelligence directs drone swarms, hacking attacks paralyze economies, and space-based lasers disable enemy defenses from the heavens. Without nuclear weapons forcing restraint, the race for technological dominance might have been even more aggressive and less regulated. But there's another dimension to consider. In our world, nuclear arms control agreements like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, and countless summits between global leaders provided frameworks for peace talks and negotiations. Without the looming threat of nuclear war, would world leaders have worked as hard to maintain peace? Or would they have simply allowed conventional wars to rage, believing them to be less dangerous, even if they were far more frequent? In this alternate timeline, the global security landscape would look radically different. Alliances might shift faster, regional wars could erupt more often, and technological arms races would focus on faster, more targeted destruction. Humanity, it seems, might be destined to find ways to fight, no matter how powerful or how devastating the weapons available. But perhaps there's a glimmer of hope in this thought experiment. Without the existential terror of nuclear annihilation, would humanity have found better ways to resolve its conflicts? Could diplomacy, economics, and cultural exchange have replaced the raw fear that holds our modern world in check? Or is our tendency toward conflict simply part of our nature, seeking new battlegrounds, whether the weapons are atomic bombs or autonomous drones? The answer may lie not in our weapons, but in ourselves. The atomic bomb showed us how easily human genius could turn toward destruction. But it also forced us to confront the limits of our aggression. In a world without that wake-up call, would we have learned the same lessons? Or would we still be struggling, blind to the true cost of war? In the end, perhaps the bomb's greatest legacy isn't its power, but the restraint it forced upon us. In a strange and tragic way, it taught humanity that some wars simply can't be won. Without it, who knows how many battles we might have fought and lost by now. So what do you think? Would a world without the atomic bomb truly be safer, or would we simply have found other ways to destroy ourselves? Is human conflict inevitable, or can we build a future where peace isn't just the absence of war, but the presence of understanding? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey through an alternate history, hit like, share the video, and subscribe for more thought-provoking what-if scenarios. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.